On this week's Political Figure episode, we've got the less popular Mormon senator. I'm gonna be honest, I didn't know shit about Mike Lee before making this video, and I feel like he keeps a little more low profile than most. Mike was born June 4th, 1971 in Mesa, Arizona. And Ronald Reagan, Solicitor General, was his father, so you know, this is gonna be fucking great. His father's name was Rex E. Lee. Kind of like the general for the Trader Tribe, except with a big head, little arms. Who names their fucking kid Rex? Is that like short for something? And I apologize to any nice people out there named Rex, but I feel like I've only ever met dogs named Rex. And Rex means king, which seems pretentious as fuck for a first name. Or a middle name, like Thomas Rex Lee, Mike's older brother. Anyway, I'm sad that Mike's name isn't Rex, because it would have made this video a lot more fun. In case you forgot, and I mentioned that Mike is Mormon, so obviously it didn't take his family long to move to Utah. And then after high school, he went to go get his degree in political science from Brigham Young University, and then he went and got his Juris Doctor from Brigham Young's law school, because, you know, Mormon. After law school, he started doing some clerkship for Judge D. Benson, and then shortly after would clerk for Justice Samuel Alito back when he was, you know, ruining the country from the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, not when he was ruining the country from the Supreme Court. Then he served as general counsel to the governor of Utah for a while before going back to clerk for Alito again once he got the job of ruining the country from the Supreme Court. He also did some private practice stuff. Most notably, he defended Energy Solutions Incorporated. And what might Energy Solutions Incorporated need to be defended from, you might ask? Nothing big. They just got in a minor dispute with the people of Utah over wanting to import radioactive waste from Italy and store it in Utah. And Mike argued that they should absolutely be allowed to do that. I mean, why wouldn't the people of Utah want Italy's radioactive waste? And then in 2010, he decided to run for a Utah Senate seat. Now, I'm not gonna lie, he kind of ran a moderate campaign for the time. Now, you gotta remember, this was the Teabag Party era, and Republicans were really starting to try to out-batshit each other at every turn. So moderation was starting to go by the wayside. And don't get me wrong, some of his campaign platforms were fucking stupid. The platforms were the stupid we were used to from Republicans. Like, he wanted to amend the Constitution to make a flat tax. Dumb, yes. New, wild, and crazy idea, not so much. Small government, fiscal conservative, yada yada, you know, most of the Reagan Republican greatest hits. But he also ran on proposing term limits for Senate and Congress. And you know what? That's something I think we can all get behind. His voting record as a senator is mixed. Now, don't get me wrong. He votes like an asshole a lot. For example, he was one of 2 senators to vote against the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund. This is the fund that provides support for first responders who are disabled because of 9/11. The bill could have been passed by unanimous consent, but Mike Lee and Rand Paul decided that that wasn't going to be allowed to happen because, you know, we just couldn't afford to help those first responders. The Fraternal Order of Police even begged Mike Lee to reconsider his position because these officers really needed the help, but that fell on deaf ears and it had to go through the long drawn-out process of passing a bill the old-fashioned way. I don't suppose anybody else sees the irony in the police union having to beg for help because Republican senators are fucking them over. No? Just me? Okay. He's also not a big fan of the gays. He got big mad at the Inter-American Court for Human Rights for suggesting that Costa Rica legalized gay marriage. He condemned the Supreme Court's ruling that gay marriage was protected by the Constitution. He said the Equality Act was counterproductive, and he voted against the Defense for Marriage Act in spite of the Mormon Church supporting the legislation. Gotta love those small government Republicans wanting to keep Uncle Sam out of people's lives. He's proposed a plan to cut Social Security spending and raise the minimum age to 70 to collect Social Security. But like I said, he's got a mixed record and it's not all bad. He voted against extending provisions of the Patriot Act to allow roving wiretaps and a bunch of unconstitutional search and seizures. On immigration, he worked with, at the time, Senator Kamala Harris. Together, they were able to remove the cap on employment-based green cards and raise the family-based green cards from 7 to 15%. He was one of 12 Republicans to tell Trump that his border wall was fucking stupid and voted to make sure that he would not get $3.6 billion in emergency funding to build it. He was also one of 4 Republicans to vote against the AHCA bill, which was a Republican's attempt to repeal parts of Obamacare. He has long argued in favor of the U.S. ending its involvement in Afghanistan and was one of the few Republicans who openly supported Biden's pullout from Afghanistan. He was one of 7 Republicans to vote to block Trump's arms deals to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan. He worked with Minnesota Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar to try to enforce some antitrust laws against big tech companies like Facebook and Apple. And at this point, you might be saying, wow, maybe Mike Lee isn't such a big piece of shit after all. I mean, yeah, he does some douchey things, but, you know, in the grand scheme of American politics, he seems kind of bipartisan and level-headed. And had his Senate career ended in 2016, I probably would have agreed with you, but you should buckle up, baby Jesus. It's about to get bumpy. In 2016, he was like the very first person to endorse Ted Cruz for president. He was also close personal friends with Ted Cruz. If you know anything about Ted Cruz, it should immediately tell you that Mike Lee is a horrible judge of character, because everybody fucking hates Ted Cruz. Democrats hate Ted Cruz, Republicans hate Ted Cruz, independents hate Ted Cruz. Hating Ted Cruz is the most bipartisan thing you can do in Washington. And that's because Ted Cruz sucks in every conceivable way. Once it became apparent in the polls that everybody hates Ted Cruz and there was absolutely no way he was going to be the nominee, Mike Lee still refused to endorse Trump. He said he couldn't endorse Trump in part because he accused his best friend's dad of assassinating JFK and that hurt his feelings, but also because he was really worried that Trump being president would act like an authoritarian or an autocrat. Remember that. It'll be important later. And in the general election, he voted for the independent candidate Evan McMullen. In the 2017 Alabama special election, he initially endorsed Roy Moore. More bad judge of character red flags going off yet? But to his credit, when it came out that Roy Moore, like half the GOP, was a pedophile accused of molesting girls as young as 14, he withdrew that endorsement. But since the rest of the GOP is totally fine with pedophiles, they still ran Roy Moore in the general election for Alabama Senate. Fortunately, the good people of Alabama told Roy Moore, fuck you, and the horse you rode in on. But not long after this, Mike Lee's sense of integrity started to erode, apparently. He started saying dumber shit, like calling the Green New Deal as absurd as a picture of Ronald Reagan riding a velociraptor, and said, I shit you not, that the way we are going to fix our economic and environmental problems was to have more babies. Cheaper by the dozen is apparently his new economic policy. I mean, why wouldn't shiny, happy people solve all of our environmental woes? To be fair, this solution does sound like some Utah shit. When it comes to Supreme Court nominations, he was one of those fucking hypocrites who was like, 8 months is too close to the election, we can't vote on Merrick Garland. And then literally weeks before the very next election, he's like, we gotta approve Amy Karen Barrett as soon as possible. And then at some point in 2019 or early 2020, he got rid of all of that pesky conscience and integrity that had been weighing him down. And he went from hating Trump to just going full knee pads for him. He started campaigning for him to the Mormons, comparing him to Captain Moron. Captain Moroni? I don't know, one of the superheroes from that comic book they worship. When the For the People Act was introduced to expand voting rights and limit the influence of money in politics with some campaign finance reform, limit partisan gerrymandering, and set up some new ethics rules and standards for public office holders, he went on Fox News and said it was as if the legislation was written by the devil himself, that it was rotten to its core. In 2020, he went on a tweet tirade saying that the United States shouldn't be a democracy and that was wrong for us to try to expand democracy. Democracy should never be our objective. He said, and I quote, our objectives should be liberty, peace, and prosperity, and democracy can thwart that. Now, reading between the lines, that sure sounds like he believes that we should have an autocracy, an authoritarian regime, a monarchy, if you will, to tell us what's good for us because we're just too fucking stupid to know better. And honestly, looking at the people who vote for him and his cohort, he might have a point. But remember when I told you that he couldn't endorse Trump because he was afraid that he was going to act like an autocrat or act authoritarian? I'm not sure how he managed to reconcile that rhetoric with his new rhetoric that says we should just have a supreme leader to tell us what's good for us. And just to make sure that the irony was thicker than Lauren Boebert's skull during her third GED attempt, not only is he saying that he now thinks we should have authoritarian rule, but the authoritarian ruler he thinks we should have is the same guy he said he couldn't endorse because he was afraid he was going to act like an authoritarian autocrat. Yeah, according to his own text messages that were uncovered by the January 6th committee, Mike Lee was claiming to be working 14 hours a day to persuade state officials to overturn election results. There was also over 100 email correspondence discussing ways to possibly overturn the election, including installing alternative electors in states that Biden won who would just vote for Trump anyway. And things started to look a little dicey for the people committing treason. He did finally come to his senses and vote to certify the election, but his actions in no small way still contributed to the treason tribe trying to overthrow the government because democracy hurt their feelings. And don't worry, him voting that way was just an attempt to save his own hide, because immediately after, he said Trump should be given, and I quote, a mulligan for his rhetoric that incited a coup. Then he voted against the formation of an independent commission to investigate January 6th, which we now know he voted against because it would show that he too was responsible in part for a treasonous insurrection. That's Mike Lee showing that you should never hold out hope that politicians won't eventually turn into giant pieces of shit, and that in this weird fucked up timeline, Mitt Romney is somehow still the best Mormon and Republican in Washington.